Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your interest in this timely topic. When I read today's Independent, one of the articles was, will a restart of housing evictions cause a COVID spike? So I'm sure we will cover that issue today. I really appreciate the time of the participants and the time of and the expertise of the panel we have. Before we start today's program, I just wanted to acknowledge that we've been doing these virtual donor briefings for a few months now, and you see Christina and I on each of the briefings, but I want to acknowledge that there's an amazing team that have been putting together these briefings with Christina and myself, and they include Carmen Burgos, Matt Higbee, and Linda Estacion. And we are going to do planning in August and take a pause from donor briefings, and we will be back with a fall program, and we will start back in September with our next donor briefing. If at the end, when you fill out your evaluations, if you have any topics that are of particular interest, please include those in your evaluation, and our committee will review them. So thanks so much. All right, before we get started, I'd like to do a little housekeeping. All participants are muted. If you have any difficulties, staff is monitoring the chat box. We will have time at the end for questions and answers. And so please put your question, if you have a burning question during the presentation and conversation, please put it in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Again, thanks for being part of our community and for your interest, and I'll turn the program over to Christina.
Thank you, Dottie, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I am thrilled to be joined by a powerhouse of expertise today on housing issues, and I look forward to the education that we are all about to get. As my co-moderator, I am really pleased to have Kellyann, who is a member of the Foundation's board and the CEO of New Reach, Kellyann Day. New Reach delivers a full range of housing services to thousands of individuals and children each year. Her and her staff are really working on the front line tackling these issues. We are also joined by Alexis Smith, who is the Executive Director of New Haven Legal Assistance, which provides legal services to individuals who otherwise can't access or afford those services. One of the issues they work on is housing and eviction issues, but they touch a broad range of issues, and Alexis and her team are really working at the intersection of very complicated social issues. And finally, we are joined by Erin Kemple, who is the Executive Director of Connecticut Fair Housing, whose mission is to ensure that all people have equal access to housing opportunities. Erin and her team they do a lot of advocacy work, and I'm getting those updates, those weekly updates from your organization, Erin, and they're actually really helpful, and I would recommend people on the line if they could sign up for those updates if you want to be updated on these issues. Lots of data and lots of information that is really good. So I'll start by setting a little background. So when the Foundation launched our initial response to COVID-19, we were making grants out of our COVID fund that were very much focused on basic needs, which includes housing. And in those initial rounds of grants, the housing issues were really focused on homelessness and the challenges around congregate housing and how do we decompress, helping to support the decompression of the homeless shelters and moving individuals into hotels and providing support around the cost of logistics and feeding those people. And so that was in our initial rounds of grant making, that's what we saw in terms of housing issues. And then after the first two rounds, I would say we started to see requests and started making grants to support rental assistance as many people started to become unemployed and need help with rental assistance. And over the course of this, our government has intervened. There is a moratorium on evictions right now that I understand from Alexis has been extended. And the government has also provided financial resources and money to address some of these issues. So I want to talk about all of those challenges and some of the things that are being done in terms of solutions. But first, I want to ask Kellyann if she wants to add any introductory remarks on behalf of the board, and if she would give us also a quick update on where we are with the homeless issues that were kind of we saw on the front end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Kellyann?
Great. Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this event. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Community Foundation, I just want to thank everyone for being here and supporting the work of the Community Foundation. I just want to give a shout out to the staff and Christina, who's through her leadership really was able to respond very quickly this past spring when COVID became a problem and a crisis for all of the nonprofits, and the Community Foundation staff just responded very quickly, and so did our donors. And so very proud to be a part of the Community Foundation. So thank you for inviting me this morning. I just want to talk a little bit about the system of Coordinated Access Network, which is what we call our system of care for folks who are homeless or at risk. You know, years ago, we had one intervention when people were homeless, and it was shelter. Now we are able to provide diversion to shelter. We have a rapid rehousing program. We have supportive housing. We're also trying to look at going upstream and providing some prevention efforts so folks don't fall into the crisis system. As Christina said, when COVID hit, we in the shelter system deconcentrated the shelters. So over 400 individuals and families were spread out in different locations, mostly in hotels and motels. But some of the shelters remained open at 50% capacity. And so those folks have been working. They're essential workers. They've been working through this entire crisis. And we meet every week regarding how to help those individuals and families that are still struggling with homelessness and with the COVID issue. I just want to say that one of the things that we have seen recently is a increase in the number of requests for shelter that we cannot meet. We do not have the capacity to meet the need right now through our cans, and this is definitely true in New Haven. New Reach provides the diversion program for CAN families. And a number of years ago, we had hundreds of families on that list. And thanks to the help of the state, as well as the Community Foundation, we were able to get that list down very low. It's now starting to creep up again. So with the possibility of the moratorium on the evictions being lifted, we're very concerned that that folks who are going to be evicted will end up in the crisis system, and the system already does not have the capacity right now to provide shelter for everyone who is requesting it. So, I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to hearing Alexis and Erin. I know they are powerhouses and champions at helping individuals and families avoid evictions. So thank you, ladies, for being here, and welcome.
Thank you, Kellyann. So before COVID-19, we had issues around housing access and instability, or else you all wouldn't be doing what you do each day. Since COVID-19, these issues have certainly been exacerbated by the crisis, and there appears to be the crisis coming out of this, which is something, at least what we're hearing about, is this looming crisis around evictions. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a moratorium on evictions, but that will end. And I'm wondering, first of all, do I have this right? Is that the looming housing crisis of the moment? I'm sure there are more than that. And if you can give us a sense of what is going to be done about this challenge, what are you anticipating, and what do you think some of the solutions are in place, and what do you think some of the solutions are we need? We'll start with you, Alexis.
Thank you, Christina. So I don't think that we can underscore the word crisis enough. And as you said, we were in a crisis moment before the pandemic started with respect to housing. The eviction lab, which tracks evictions throughout the country, If you look at their 2016 numbers, Connecticut had 4 cities in the top 100 for evictions: Waterbury, Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven, which is pretty astounding. Our rates of evictions per year in Connecticut are about 20,000, and that's about 18 households per week. So we really were in a crisis in January and February. And now what we're seeing is kind of unprecedented times with respect to job loss and income loss. You know, I often say when people come to our office with a housing issue, a housing matter, really they're coming to us with an income issue. They've lost a job, they're unable to make ends meet. And so I think what we're concerned about is when this moratorium ends, which it was just recently extended through the end of August, what happens? What happens to the people who have not been able to pay their rent since the pandemic started, but who are still unemployed, who still have no income coming in? And so that's a serious concern for our community. And I want to, just make it very clear that we people hear about national statistics around housing and evictions all the time and think that it's really just a national problem that we don't have to deal with. But in fact, right here in our community, it is a big issue, and it's something that we need to address as a community.
Thank you, Alexis. Erin, do you want to address the eviction issue? And also an additional question on top of this is also how this is impacting the landlords. I've seen a lot in the news lately about landlords who are not receiving their rent payments because of the eviction moratorium, which then affects their ability to potentially pay mortgages, and that has a trickle-down effect. So I wonder if you also have any comments on that.
Thank you very much. So with regards to the eviction crisis, the one thing I would add to what Alexis has already said is that this eviction crisis, and as well as other eviction crises, is really hitting people of color and communities of color harder than white communities. And the reason for that is that people of color rent their homes at almost 3 times the rate of whites. And in addition to that, people of color tend to have are most often in the jobs that were eliminated. So they were some of the people who were laid off early as janitors or as people working in supermarkets or something along those lines. So this is really a crisis that is going to hit our communities of color particularly hard. And part of that is because of the way that the housing market has functioned for such a long time. There's a high rate of redlining in Connecticut, meaning that it's very difficult for people of color to get mortgages. And in a lot of instances, what we're finding is that communities of color that were redlined have since been eliminated. And so any people who are living in those communities have since lost the ability to return to home ownership. With regards to how this is hitting landlords, it's really hard to give as clear an answer to that as we do as to how it's hitting evictions. So any landlord who has a mortgage that is a federally backed mortgage by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, or has an FHA mortgage, is supposed to be able to get a forbearance and be able to renegotiate with their lender how they're going to be paying their mortgage over the next 12 months. So while they may not be getting the amount of income that they expected from their rental places, that does not mean that they're going to be completely unable to pay their mortgages, because in fact they are entitled to a forbearance or a renegotiation. However, being unable to get any income from their properties does have a trickle-down effect, as you already mentioned. It means that they may not be able to pay their property taxes, which is going to affect all of our municipalities. It means they may not be able to do the kinds of maintenance and reconstruction that is needed in order to keep the housing in good condition. Having said all that, the other thing that I think we're all worried about is that we're seeing double-digit increases in the number of people moving to Connecticut in every county in Connecticut. And as a result of that, a lot of landlords have an incentive not to work with their tenants, and simply allow an eviction or send a notice and get the tenant out, because they know that they're going to be able to rent to someone in another, they can pay a higher rent. And I just got a question in the chat and I want to respond to it. Redlining is still an issue in Connecticut. We have been investigating redlining throughout the state of Connecticut for the past several years and have found evidence of redlining in every single community in Connecticut. How is it enabled? It's enabled by the fact that groups like mine don't have the resources to go after every single bank that is redlining, or necessarily assist every single person who might be the victim of redlining, in part because a lot of people who are the victims of redlining don't know it. They don't know that if they lived in a white community with the income that they have and their credit and everything else, they would be able to get a mortgage. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of is that people of color are unable to get conventional mortgages, which tend to have fewer costs and fewer upfront fees, and instead are being told that they have to get an FHA mortgage, even though they income qualify and credit qualify for a conventional mortgage. But that's a whole other issue that I could spend hours on, and I know that this is really to talk about the coming eviction crisis.
Thank you, Erin. That was informative. I've been talking with some of my colleagues at other foundations about this issue and about the state resources and philanthropic resources. And in one of our recent conversations, we were talking about what I think is $10 million that the state has put up to help with the eviction crisis. I may not have that number exactly right. You all will tell me. But we were talking about that up against what someone had projected was a $400 million need. So I'm wondering, maybe Alexis, if you could start and talk a little bit about what are these financial resources and pots of money that have become available through the federal and state resources. How do people access those? Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's actually I think the allocation was about $17.5 million in rental assistance and housing assistance for people in need. And I would say that that's not even close to being enough. Not when we're looking at an unemployment rates of about 14% right now. So kind of the process that people use to access some of these programs can be pretty cumbersome, quite frankly. Our office did a Know Your Rights presentation very recently to give people information about how you can apply for these programs. And the most recent rental assistance program was for folks who have been denied unemployment compensation, which are quite a few. But you have to go through the process of applying for unemployment benefits first, and then trying to access the rental assistance, which can be really cumbersome for people generally, but particularly for people who are under stress, with children, really trying to make ends meet. So one of the things that we've been involved in, and it's actually a national movement, and there are people in Connecticut kind of on the ground doing this work, is a campaign around cancel rent, right, which people may be familiar with, which actually asks that rent be forgiven until we are past the pandemic. It is seen by some people, I think, as radical, but I think we are in a time where we need to do radical things. It's kind of put in the same category as when you hear defund police. I think that is kind of in the same vein, but I think we're at a time where we can't do things the way we have been doing for many, many decades. We're at a critical moment where we need to attack some of these problems. I think what Erin mentioned about sort of the history of, why this is problematic, particularly for communities of color, is, the history of housing right here in Connecticut, but nationally. We have a history of exclusion, and many Black and brown families have not been able to access homeownership in the same way and at the same rates that white families have. And if I look at our eviction numbers in our office, I mean, last year we had 482 new clients come through our door for housing matters. Of the 482, 216 were Black women, right? And that actually is the trend nationally. Black women are landlords file evictions at twice the rate against Black women as they do as opposed to white renters. So it's a real issue. So in terms of addressing the problem on a large scale, we really need to think of broad amounts of money, and much larger than 17.5 million. That's just not doesn't even begin to kind of bite at the apple.
Right. Erin, did you want to respond to that in terms of the federal and state resources that have become available to evictions and how those are being accessed, or rental assistance rather?
So the 17.5 million that Alexis referred to, it's not just here, come and get $17.5 million, people who need rent. There's only $10 million that is allocated to people who need rental assistance who don't fall into any other category. But there are a lot of other requirements that go along with that. So in order to get priority one, you have to have been denied unemployment, as well as have children living with you and have income in 2019 less than about 60% of area median income. What we're hearing from the Department of Housing is that they're getting over 1,300 calls a day, of which only about 400 actually are able to talk to someone. And of that 400, only 150 are moved on to the next step. And there are two more steps that you have to get through in order to actually qualify. And the majority of people who are not moving on to the next step simply don't have access to something like their income tax return from 2019, or they're reluctant to give their social security number over the telephone. All of those things disqualify the people up front. And with regards to what Alexis Smith was saying with regards to cancel rent, the cancel rent campaign, as Alexis mentioned, is to cancel rent for people who are, for tenants that they would not have to pay. That doesn't mean landlords wouldn't get money. And I think what the advocates in Connecticut have advocated is not to make the tenants jump through the hoops that I've just described and go on to step 2 and step 3. We have people who are living very hand to mouth. Why aren't the landlords the ones who are being asked to verify how much rent they have lost and that their tenant is still living there, and then they can get the money? So I think there's an inadequate amount of money, but I also think that the way that the money is being doled out has a lot of issues with it. It's not accessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It's not accessible to people who speak a language other than English or Spanish. It's not accessible to people who are disabled and unable to stay on the phone for an hour or 2 hour waiting on hold, not to mention the fact that there's a great digital divide, and so that a lot of the people who are low income don't have the minutes on their telephone to wait for an hour. Or to make numerous calls, because one of the other things we're hearing is that people are just getting hangups. So there's a lot that's going on with the programs that are making it difficult for people to access what is even out there.
Thank you, Erin. What you two have just described seems quite overwhelming and quite complicated. And I'm wondering if you have ideas or opinions about the role for philanthropy in all of this. I mean, clearly there's not enough government money. Philanthropy is usually never in a position to fill those huge gaps. What are some things that organizations like ours and the people, like we have people on the line here today, what are some things we can do to help address this and have an impact?
I mean, I'll start. I think one thing that is a source of frustration for me is we often blame people who are living in poverty for the problems that they have, right? And I think housing is one of those. I mean, the language that I hear either landlords or quite frankly, people in court or opposing counsel use with respect to someone who can't pay their rent. Why can't you just pay it? Or it kind of goes back to this, idea of the so-called American dream, where everyone should be able to make it. Just work hard, and you shouldn't be in the position that you're in. And so, I really think that we need to take a close look at the lack of compassion that I think is the effort of lack of compassion that's put towards people in these situations, and go back to, well, why are these families in this situation? And they are because of structures and systems that have been put in place over time and that have evolved over time and have allowed to exist over time. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think the other thing is being creative. You know, to your point, there isn't enough government funding to help solve this problem, but there definitely is enough philanthropic support out there, right? I mean, the fact that we are seeing people who were already incredibly wealthy have their wealth increase during the pandemic, and that's a reality. Some people have benefited. When you juxtapose that with the 675,000 people in Connecticut who have applied for unemployment insurance since the pandemic started, that's a real problem. And so we always kind of think about this in terms of limitations and scarcity. You know, the pie is only so big. There's so many people who need to have access, so many organizations who need to have access, as opposed to thinking differently and saying, well, wait a minute. As Nicole Hannah-Jones put it when she was asked about, you know, why can't the government fund reparations? If we can send someone to the moon, we can provide and invest in communities in the way that they need to be invested in. So I really think that the focus needs to shift, the language needs to shift in looking at things in a sense of abundance as opposed to limitations and scarcity.
I'm just curious too, Alexis and Erin, you know, the service providers who are working in the greater New Haven area with folks who are falling into crisis, you know, how can they help support the work that you guys are doing on the legal side to try to provide services upstream for households? I was especially thinking when you mentioned the number of Black women who are evicted, and it's typically they have children with them, and it's very difficult for them to access some of these programs when they have children and the children aren't in school or camp. I'm just wondering, have you guys thought about how we can help with that?
So I'll try answering first. Kellyan's organization and mine, as well as several others, tried to get funding to do eviction prevention work last year, and were denied that. And it was a really comprehensive program that was based upon Kellyan's work in Fairfield County, where they were doing intensive work with people who are on the verge of eviction and trying to access all kinds of benefits for people that maybe hadn't been allowed to them before, as well as I think a key portion of that was legal assistance. And I think that is something, you know, to answer the very specific question that Christina put to us, what can philanthropy do? I think one of the things philanthropy can do is fund lawyers. Going along with what Alexis said, that there is this idea that people who are poor sort of deserve it because they haven't done something right. And that goes along with, well, why do they need lawyers? Because they have not done something right. They didn't pay their rent, as opposed to the program that Kellyann and my agency put together, which looked at what Alexis said, which was, why aren't people paying the rent? What has happened in this family that has resulted in this family being on the verge of homelessness? And I think one of the things, one of the key pieces that's missing is attorneys, because we know from watching housing court day after day after day that people without lawyers are not going to be able to keep their housing, even if the landlord has made a mistake in the filing or has overstated the amount of rent that's owed or something along those lines. There's nothing there that allows the tenant to put some of those defenses or get some of that attention that they need. And the other thing that I really want to point out is that if we don't do some of the work that Kellyan's group is doing, as well as the lawyers at New Haven Legal Assistance to prevent people from being evicted, we're going to see a surge in COVID-19 infections again. Because even if people don't go to a homeless shelter, they're going to be doubled up and tripled up, and that's going to result in not only an increase in the number of people who are infected, but it's also, in my opinion, going to affect people for years and years into the future, because the kids aren't going to be able to access school as well. The kids aren't going to be able to get the kind of nutrition help that they may need because their family doesn't have enough food for them, and the kind of parenting they need. I mean, it was just on another call where people were talking about how families that are in danger of losing their homes don't just go to a shelter because they're concerned about what their kids might be exposed to, even though I don't think they're going to be exposed to anything particularly bad, but they then divide their kids up. And so instead of being parented by mom and having mom's rules and mom's expectations, you're now living with, your best friend's mother or your aunt or someone like that. And I think that in the long run is going to hurt children too.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is really highlighting the point Erin is talking about, which I think you could capture as housing as just a basic human fundamental right, and it really can determine life or death, right? We see this across the country, including in Connecticut. Your zip code can dictate kind of everything, from your kids' schooling to what kind of healthcare access you have. And so I think that's really important for people to understand. And kind of related to that is the significance of an eviction. If you have an eviction on your record, if you are in fact evicted, that impedes your ability to get housing going forward, because that becomes part of your record, so to speak. And so people have kind of analogized having an eviction on your record to getting housing to having a criminal record and being able to get employment going forward. So lawyers really do matter, especially in this kind of situation, and keeping people housed from a health standpoint, but also from a long-term standpoint, and how these evictions can impact individuals and individual families.
And we found that the partnership between social workers and lawyers is essential.
So Alexis, we heard about the barriers. I think Erin was talking about the barriers that individuals face and all these hoops they have to jump through to try to access assistance. And we heard that it's really important. We need lawyers. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, how many lawyers do you actually have on staff? And how are you preparing for this looming crisis? And if you could talk a little bit about the system that the lawyers are working within, because we were talking briefly before the call, and it sounds like the court system, and that once you get the clients, the court system is backed up as well.
That's right. So I'm just going to start by saying we don't have enough lawyers doing housing work in my office to meet the demand. Because there has been a moratorium right now, we've not seen as many individual cases as we do on a regular basis. We have 3 lawyers in our team. We have 1 paralegal, and we have some interns and fellows that also help with housing, and then 2 people on our senior management team have a housing background. But housing is the biggest area of what we do at New Haven Legal Assistance, year in and year out. We have a number of different units. We have employment, immigration, education, family, benefits, child law, but housing year in and year out is the biggest area on a regular basis. And I think that, quite frankly, speaks to a larger issue in our state of the lack of affordability of housing. In order to afford market rate housing in Connecticut, your hourly wage should be about $25 an hour. But we know that minimum wage is $11 an hour. So there is this significant gap. And so people are living in spaces that they can barely afford. People are spending the vast majority of their income, more than they should, on renting. So I think what is looming for us is, first of all, after the initial moratorium was implemented by Governor Lamont, we saw about 800 evictions that were filed after the first moratorium. So those are cases that are right now pending. Those individuals, for the most part, are going to need lawyers. So we've got to figure that out, right? How do we manage 800 people or 800 families? And I think there are landlords who are just literally waiting for the end of the moratorium to file more evictions. So I think we are on the verge coming this fall of something really unprecedented. I think one of the largest concerns we have is access to the court system, because courts generally, particularly housing court, are not going to look like they did back in February and January and last year. We have thousands of people literally coming through housing court on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, and you're not going to be able to have that same traffic flow as you once did. So what happens? Well, the courts are moving to virtual court hearings, and that presents a number of different issues for our client population, technology being just one, but also kind of space, as I would say. Where do you do those kinds of hearings? Can you do it in your home for various reasons? What happens if schools don't reopen? What happens? How do you manage childcare and a court hearing? So these are all looming issues that our team is trying to address. And we're actually doing this on a statewide basis with the other legal aid organizations as well. But it's a real concern, not only for housing, but for all of the areas that we do. I know the judicial branch is working and trying to figure out how this will work going forward. But we have a number of concerns for the clients who we serve, who we're going to serve, and then the thousands of unrepresented, self-represented people as well who don't get to us for various reasons.
Thanks, Alexis. We have some questions coming in and comments
Christina,
from the audience that we want to get to. Go ahead, Erin.
Just one sec. So I want to put this whole thing in context with regards to what we're looking at. We have been tracking the number of evictions filed over the last 10 to 15 years by getting information from the judicial branch. And in Connecticut, since January 1st, there have been 4,715 evictions filed. And this is since the moratorium was declared in April. So we know that there's a lot of evictions that have already been filed. Last year, 2019, there were 19,000 evictions filed. And according to a survey done by Department of Housing, landlords stated that they expected the number of evictions that they would file this year to double. So we're looking at almost 40,000 eviction filings between August 22nd and the end of the year. Just to put that in context.
Wow. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I would encourage audience members to type your questions into the Q&A. I'll try to get to some of these. So one person is asking what happened to the proposal, Erin, that you were mentioning that you did in collaboration with New Reach, and has it been resubmitted somewhere else?
It was a 3-year proposal submitted to JP Morgan Chase, and we were denied funding for that, and they have not yet made that funding available. We have not had a chance to submit it anyplace else, but that is on the agenda for the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. I will also say that the Board of Directors of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center has decided to use up to $200,000 of its cash reserve in order to fund an attorney and a paralegal to do eviction work. We have not yet hired for those positions, but we will be adding to the number of people who will be representing people in evictions. Not a lot, but a little.
So someone has asked, are there programs in other states that other states have implemented due to this current crisis that we can replicate, or lessons we could learn from them?
I will say that there's a program that's being piloted right now in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a coalition of eviction prevention providers that are working, and they're using the CARES Act money to hire lawyers. And they're partnering again with the social service providers, and they're looking at doing a risk assessment as well, so that they're making sure that they are working with the folks who are at highest risk of potentially becoming homeless. So that's a program that we can take a look at and keep watching.
Alexis, someone is asking about what is the total, well, they're saying lawyer fee, but what is the total cost for a typical housing case? You're going to say there is no typical housing case, right?
Yeah, I mean, there really isn't. I mean, I think one thing that I'll say sort of related to that is why I think lawyers are important in housing cases is that they move very quickly, right? They don't move the way that many other kinds of cases move. You could have a housing case from start to finish that can be done in about a month's time. And so having a lawyer with you to navigate that process, to pay attention to deadlines for filing things, to pay attention to court hearings is really, really important. So the timing is very critical, and a lawyer can make a big difference. And I don't know if Erin mentioned this or not. I think you may have, but the number of landlords who are represented in housing court far exceeds that of tenants. Renters are represented by lawyers about 10% of the time, as opposed to landlords 90% of the time, which can also make a difference in terms of what a tenant will be required to do. One thing that can sometimes happen or often happens is tenants are required to pay the attorney's fees for a landlord. And so making sure that that is not another burden written into an agreement that a client signs is really, really critical, and having a lawyer makes that difference.
Wow, that seems backwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me see.
Christina,
Yep.
with regards to the
Erin.
answer to that question, when Kellyann and I and a couple of other groups were submitting our application to JP Morgan Chase, we did find a law firm that did not represent landlords, and sometimes that's difficult. And they agreed to accept 100 case referrals in exchange for $40,000 a year. Now, those cases would not be the kind that Alexis was talking about, where there was a lot of work that needed to be done, a lot of investigation. You know, these were the ones that Alexis described as being in and out in possibly a month or less. But that's one of the ways that we have thought of increasing the number of people who are handling cases. And by paying them, they are not pro bono cases, and as a result, they should not take a lesser focus than some of the pro bono cases that people take. And then when they get involved in cases that are paying, they have to put some of their pro bono work on hold. So this was a way we thought of getting the private bar involved and paying them to actually do this work the same as they were being paid to do other kinds of work.
Someone has asked what role community organizing plays in your work. Do you want to answer that, Erin? Do you want to start?
No. I'm going to let Alexis, because she is the one who's really doing, her agency is doing the community.
Yeah,
Alexis?
I mean, I think organizing is critical in all of our work, but particularly housing. You know, keeping people, and we've seen it most recently in the Cancel Rent campaign, but also we've seen it in getting information to people, right? So informing people about what is happening at the state and local level with respect to housing policies, housing changes, getting people informed about how they go about applying for rental assistance and what programs are available to them, and how do they navigate all of that. But I think organizing is also really important in informing what the community wants and needs. You know, I think lawyers many times think that we have all of the answers, and organizers have much more of a connection to the community in a different kind of way, in a different sense. And so they are our connection to the community. So I think we try to use we have 2 organizers on staff. Our goal is that they kind of inform us about the pulse of the community, and what is really happening on the ground, and how we can partner with the community in different ways and innovative ways to affect the change that these communities need.
So we have another question, which is a big question and kind of gets to another topic I wanted to cover, was how can we address the root causes of the housing crisis so that we are not fighting evictions, but supporting housing that works? And I'm wondering if this perfect storm is actually creating an opportunity for reform and getting to these root causes. The foundation recently signed on to support a reform initiative called Desegregate Connecticut, which is a package of legislative reforms which gets to some of these issues. The hope was that that was going to be addressed in the special session, and then it's not being addressed. So I'm wondering if you, both of you or the three of you, can say something about how we get to the root causes and the role advocacy and policy plays in that. Who wants to start? Erin?
I'll start. One of the things that I think everyone who has been working with people who are low income, people who are disabled, people of color throughout Connecticut is trying to increase the number of places where there's affordable housing that they can live, and Desegregate Connecticut is one of those efforts. One of the things that my agency continues to look at, though, is whether or not the efforts are actually going to lead to desegregation or resegregation. And one of the things that we have seen over the years is a lot of efforts that were supposed to be helping the people who are living in communities of color, actually resulting in higher degrees of segregation. So if you look at a lot of the urban renewal efforts that were done in the 60s, 70s, and even in the late 50s, a lot of those efforts resulted in the elimination of communities of color, but didn't actually help anyone move into areas that were less segregated or had higher degrees of access to school, high performing schools, et cetera. What it did is really gentrify a lot of communities. And so what happened was, and this happened in the city of Hartford, and I've actually written a report that talks about this, is that the city of Hartford really did a lot to include housing in downtown Hartford over the last 5 to 10 years, include a lot of different types of housing, and yet none of that, or almost only 6% of that housing was actually available to people who are low income. And that's what we are most concerned about, is that when you gentrify, when you put in housing and you do things that result in the increase in the value of housing in a particular area, that what you're doing is pushing out long-term residents who put up with the crime, who put up with the neglect by the cities and towns. And that's really what we are very concerned about, is what we call the both and approach. Yes, we need to invest in our cities. We need to ensure that they are not being neglected, while at the same time we are requiring the suburbs and the other parts of Connecticut to step up and do their part to ensure that they are all getting people, allowing people to live there regardless of their income or their race or their national origin or even their legal status within Connecticut.
There's
I
a
would
question
absolutely
about-
agree. I would absolutely agree with Erin, Christina. I think that affordable housing in areas that are safe, especially the work that we do with families. Many times the families who are coming into the shelters have been pushed out of housing. And then there's a ripple effect on the children for years to come. You know, a child who is homeless is more likely to be homeless as an adult. I think we have to push for more affordable housing.
And I guess what I would add to that is, and I think Desegregate Connecticut is having these conversations, but kind of a larger, bigger picture question is, you know, have we convinced people that desegregating our state is something we want to do, right? Are people on board with that? Do people understand why desegregation is important? Do they understand why it's important that our kids be able to go to school together? Do they understand why it's important to have neighbors that don't look like you? Is it important to have people who are in various leadership positions in your community who are of a different race and ethnicity? So I think we many times get bogged down in the paper and what the policy is going to look like, what the plan is going to look like. And then I think we've all seen those public hearings, those zoning meetings that happen where these plans aren't necessarily supported because there is this history, right? There's this history of segregation. There's this history of the backdrop of racism and exclusion. And so having that really fundamental conversation about why do we need to do this and why is it important that we do this right now at this moment is critical.
Thank you, Alexis. I want to ask each of you if you could say a few words about, given how complicated and overwhelming this is, and I'm sure the three of you have many sleepless nights worrying about these things. But I want to hear about what gives you hope, or what are some of the hopeful things that you are seeing around housing and addressing this crisis. Erin, do you want to go first?
I think we're all trying to think, really, hope. What would that look like? I think that for me and the people that I work with at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, the fact that there is more understanding of the racial components and the national origin components of the crisis that we're in. People of color have been the worst hit by the COVID-19 crisis. They've been the worst hit by the unemployment. They've been the worst hit they are going to be the worst hit by eviction. And for people like the three of us who have been in this work for a long time, it's not a surprise to us. We knew that this was going on. We understood the effect that our society has had on people of color and their housing options. The fact that other people are finally starting to see it and that they're finally really trying to grapple with it, like the people who have joined your learning series, it gives me hope because I no longer feel like we are just out there howling in the wilderness with people going on about their lives as if this wasn't happening to the people who live in their communities.
Thank you, Erin. What about you, Alexis?
So I have kind of a hope and a simultaneous worry. I think the hope is very much what Erin said about the kind of awakening that people have had, this reckoning with many of these issues that have been going on for a long time. And it's just been kind of the perfect storm because we've had this pandemic situation that has kept people at home, right? So we're not going to work, we're not driving kids around to activities, we're not going to things that we normally do, and so people can sit down on a Friday at 12 o'clock and tune into this, right? And people are tuning in on a Saturday on Zoom to different organizations holding various events and Zooms around these conversations and these issues. So I'm hopeful in that sense that there has been this eye-opening and people are starting to realize the importance of paying attention and getting involved. I think we've seen this with the demonstrations that have happened around the country that have been, kind of a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-age participation. I guess what my worry is as we get closer and closer to the time when we're reopening things, right? People are going back to work, whatever iteration, whatever form schools take on. As we get back to that, people's focus going away from these issues and from housing in particular. And so what do we do? How do we keep people's interest? How do we keep people's focus? Because the pandemic is going to hit our client population, as Erin said, much harder than anyone else. And it's going to be one that is lasting, right? I think if you look at 2008, 2009, that lasted an incredibly long time for low-income people and people of color. And this is going to be the same, perhaps even worse. And so how do we maintain people's interest and willingness to engage and do the right thing?
Thank you, Alexis. Kellyann, do you want to tell us what gives you hope and offer any final remarks before we close this up?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. There are two things that give me hope. They fill my well when I need my well to be filled. The first is the energy of people like Alexis and Erin and other leaders around the state that have not only been doing this work for years, but have brought extreme energy, positive energy, and advocacy to this issue of helping. That gives me hope. The second is the residents that we serve and the clients that we serve. I very often get an opportunity to talk to the families, the women and children, the individuals who are looking for shelter or in shelter or have been recently housed. And those folks give me hope because they're not giving up. They're continuing to take care of their kids. They're continuing to go to work. They're continuing to live their lives as a healthy and productive as they possibly can. And so that gives me hope. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and thank the Community Foundation for putting together this forum. It's a very important topic. So thank you. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Kellyann, and thank you all. I think one thing that gives me hope is knowing that the three of you are working on these issues every day, and I see some comments in the chat to that same effect. So thank you to the three of you and all the work you do. There are some other really good questions in the Q&A and comments in the chat. We can incorporate that. I'm sorry we didn't get to everything, but we can incorporate some of that into our follow-up email. Many of you know the drill by now, but we send out a follow-up after each of these sessions, which kind of summarizes what we heard and includes some additional information or information that came up in the conversation. So look forward to that. Again, thank you all. I'm going to pass it back to Dottie now to close us out. Dottie?
Thanks, Christina. And I see that Will may be coming on. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing this information. Thanks to the audience and Erin's comment and Alexis's comment that our donors give us hope every day. They're passionate people that care about this community and have done so much extraordinary work during COVID-19 and during this pandemic. I know we'll continue to. So thank you so much. And one other action step you can make when you get that email from me next week is pass it on to someone else that you wasn't able to join the call today and might be interested in the topic, because we did record this session. So please send the word out. It's an important topic. And I'll turn it over to Will.
Well, I just want to say thank you also to everyone who participated and to Kellyann and Alexis and Erin for all you've shared with us, both the challenges and the hopefulness and everything in between. And maybe close on a note that goes back to something that Alexis said pretty much at the beginning of this very good session, which is that this really is around housing issues and the eviction threat, and more broadly around so many issues that impact our community, that are impacting in particular people of color in our community and in communities all across this country. This is a moment that's unlike others in terms of the depth of the challenges we face. And it's also a moment of change, a sense of real possibility as to change, and a sense that everyone recognizes that the old solutions and the old approaches have been inadequate for a long time, and their inadequacy is being shown more clearly now than when we could falsely convince ourselves that maybe we were on the path to solving these problems. So that's the way we're thinking about it at the Community Foundation, that this is a moment, it's an extraordinary moment, certainly a moment of extraordinary challenge and need, but also a moment of opportunity for change. And I hope everybody thinks about it that way. That's the way the community needs to respond. I know that Kellyann and Alexis and Erin do. And we are deeply appreciative of the work you do every day. And I thank everybody who's been on this webinar for the last hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone.
And we encourage you to fill out the evaluation and put topics that you would be interested in hearing about in the fall. Thanks and be well, everyone.
Thank you.